possibly be 2010 all over again? MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, talking down the South Carolina game, hosting Alabama this week. We got Will Gunter on the line from 107.5 The Game. His show is the all-new early game. Will, how you doing tonight?
Well, it's funny. I'm feeling older. My daughter turned 10 years old yesterday, and you just brought up 2010, and it does not feel that long ago that South Carolina pulled off the biggest upset in their history, or won the biggest game in their history. Steve Spurrier's crowning achievement, I guess you could say. So, just another sign that I am not as young as I used to be.
Okay, I'll give you some numbers to run by in regards to how old your kids are to make you feel old. Will, we don't want to play that game. I don't want to play that game. That's for sure. So, Jake Bentley, my goodness, and I know that this is kind of old news to a certain extent, but in regards to the games that people pay attention to, so not a whole lot of eyes on the Coastal Carolina affair. Of course, Jake Bentley going down. And his senior season's wiped away. So we got Ryan Hilinski in play.
72 points. Charleston Southern, an FCS team, and completely on the opposite end of the spectrum when you talk about Alabama. But certainly a game that South Carolina needed. 775 yards of total offense, which was a school record. They ran for 493 yards, I believe, which was also a school record. So certainly a get-well day, but a chance for Ryan Hilinski to get out there and kind of get his feet wet and see how things went or would go, and certainly something that South Carolina fans now maybe have a little bit more energy about, and maybe just a little bit more excitement following last Saturday.
So, most people expected this team to be 2-0 and maybe not necessarily threaten Alabama, but the preseason look was, okay, they beat North Carolina, they win the next game, and they're 2-0 for Alabama. And then the brutal schedule ensues from there, and we may not see them past November, but at least 2-0 entering the big game against Alabama. Obviously, they get tripped up against North Carolina. What were your concerns about what we saw against the Heels? Because obviously that's the game that we can measure the Gamecocks by, a game that they never separated themselves, but they seem to have under control to a certain extent there in the third and fourth quarter.
Yeah, everything was a concern. There wasn't anything that you walked out of that game and said, boy, I feel good about that. The game plan was awful. The tackling was awful. The passing was awful. The running game was average at best. The offensive line was awful. And yet South Carolina was leading 20-9 with about 14 minutes to go. And then everything that is Will Muschamp, every perception, every stereotype of Will Muschamp, he punts it on 4th and 1 at the 49. He punts it on 4th and 8. At the North Carolina 38, Jake Bentley cannot hit a wide-open Shi Smith that would have won the game, a wide-open pass about 30 yards down the field. And, of course, then Bentley would end up being injured on the final play. But, no, everything. I mean, there was nothing that I walked out of, or anybody walked out of the North Carolina game saying that they felt good about the Gamecocks. Maybe if there's any consolation, it's the fact that North Carolina then comes back and beats Miami last week 28-25, and Sam Howell continues to look like a kid who's not a freshman. But that first game was certainly tough for Gamecock fans, and maybe it's changed the perception for what fan base, for what Will Muschamp had left onto a bad side. So maybe not going to earn it back this week, but he'll have opportunities as we move forward.
Looking at the SEC picture, Will, as it runs through Alabama and has for quite a few years, of course, they had a similar type game as South Carolina last week. Duke didn't provide much resistance. So maybe this is the first opponent that gets their attention a little bit.
Well, whether it gets the players' attention or just Nick Saban's, I'm not sure. We'll find out on Saturday afternoon, obviously at about 4 o'clock, 30 minutes into the game. Nick Saban has already talked about the 2019 game in his the 2010 game in his press conference, so he remembers it. But the players, as he pointed out, were probably in about 6th grade, so a little bit of a difference there for guys who maybe think this is a revenge game. But Alabama's a good football team. There's no doubt about that, and there's a talent gap between Alabama and South Carolina, and we will see kind of how that plays out Saturday afternoon. What kind of game plan Will Muschamp can come up with to offset some of the disadvantages his football team will have.
Will Gunter on the line from 107.5 The Game. His show is the all-new early game, bright and early, Monday through Friday. And Will joins us on a regular basis, has for a number of years, to break down the Gamecocks. And before we move on to the rest of the SEC and the nation, Will, because I always like to get your take on the national look in the SEC as well. Was there anything else with this matchup that you think gives South Carolina some hope of pulling off another 2010 version? You're silent. Yeah, it's difficult to find.
To be honest, the North Carolina game last week was good for South Carolina. They needed it. But the North Carolina game, South Carolina gives up 283 yards rushing to North Carolina. North Carolina is not expected to be a great rushing team. South Carolina gives up 240 yards to Sam Howell, making his first ever college appearance. Not start, but just flat out appearance. There were some questions about tackling. Again, even if you factor in Jake Bentley's inconsistency throughout his career, South Carolina didn't take shots downfield when they had the opportunity. This will be fun to see what Ryan Holinsky can do. It'll be fun to kind of get a gauge maybe on where South Carolina is. But honestly, the next 2 weeks are where everything matters. Missouri next week in Columbia. Kentucky at home the week after. Kentucky just loses Terry Wilson. That'll tell us more about this South Carolina team, which I kind of still refuse to believe is as bad as we saw against North Carolina. But again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe North Carolina looks poised to roll out to a 4-0 start before Clemson faces them at the end of the month.
Taking a look at the SEC and by extension the nation, because if you win the SEC, you are good to go. LSU caught everybody's attention last week, and especially on offense, they unveiled the new offense for a quality opponent. And Joe Burrow just cut loose, 471 through the air, 4 touchdowns. Auburn took care of business. It's in its huge game against Oregon. Florida did against Miami. Georgia's got Notre Dame next week. Where do you see this thing going? And the SEC has taken a few hits for some of its mid to low tier teams, laying an egg on the national stage. Of course, the Wyoming win over Missouri and Tennessee more than anyone. But your thoughts about the SEC?
Yeah, I still think it's kind of what I thought. Nothing has changed my perception of the beginning of the year. You still got You still got Alabama and Georgia as the lead dogs. LSU was fantastic. One thing that's not being talked about, really a shame, is Joe Burrow was good. Don't get me wrong, but Joe Burrow, his wide receivers made some incredible catches on Saturday night. I mean, Burrow put the ball in places where only his receivers could get them, but those are tough passes to catch, and you got to give LSU a lot of credit for the way that those receivers played. I'll be interested to see that team as they move through the year, but it looks like Joe Brady coming in, Steve Enzinger seem to have a good connection on how they want to run that offense, and certainly based on what we saw Saturday night, it looks like Ed Orgeron is going to stay out of the offensive meeting rooms and maybe the play calling and do what he does best, and that's coach defensive line and speak some form of Cajun. But to me, the bottom line is I think LSU is closer. I think the new polls came out this week, and LSU is number 4 in there, and I can get on board with that. After that, I'm still not buying Florida. I think the depth is a major issue. C.J. Henderson went down with an injury on Saturday night. We'll see if he's back this coming week. I have not seen an update, but that's not necessarily been what I've been following. That Florida team, to me, is still very much an enigma. I don't have them as a top 10 team. I don't think they're a top 20 team. And there's nothing against Miami, who's 0-2, that showed me that Florida's ready to be in that discussion. Texas A&M, I was kind of buying into, but that 24-10 score by Clemson was not indicative of how that game went. Clemson gave up the opening field goal. Kellen Mond was way off for the majority of the game and showed me a guy who's not progressed from year 1 in Jimbo Fisher's system to year 2. I don't know what Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher are going to do now without Jayshon Corbin to take some of the pressure off of Mond. But I look at that Texas A&M team, and I have to compare everything to South Carolina, or that's what I try and do. Going into the year, I didn't think Texas A&M was just head and shoulders better than South Carolina, and so I looked at that game in November on the 16th between A&M and South Carolina. I thought, well, that's a winnable game for South Carolina. I wouldn't pick them to win, but that's a winnable game. I still feel that way, and if I feel that way about A&M, to me, that's a borderline top 25 team that's in a big transition. And then, as you mentioned, you go through the rest of the conference. I'll be interested to see what Auburn continues to do. Bo Nix was very good late in that game against Oregon and certainly had the big touchdown pass. We'll see where they go from there. what happens with Kentucky now that Terry Wilson is out? Awful injury for him. Maybe an upgrade. Terry Wilson wasn't exactly the best passer in the world, so we'll see what happens with Kentucky's offense. Does it become a little bit more dynamic with a guy who can throw the football and isn't just a runner back there? So I think the league is in an interesting place. You're right. Missouri, who knows what exactly Missouri is going to be right now. Certainly, they thumped West Virginia this past weekend, but West Virginia is in shambles, even with Austin Kendall at quarterback. And Missouri's defense didn't impress me at all against Wyoming. So we'll see where all that kind of moves with some of the mid-tier teams, South Carolina included, over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, Clemson's just amazingly good, but what A&M showed us on Saturday was a disappointment to me because I felt as though, they got a little full of themselves. They talked a big game, then they go in. Mond was awful. Even the wide receiver core, which I think is exceptional, they dropped a ton of passes. They didn't make plays. They played really hard. If you, like you say, you look at the score and it wasn't indicative. Clemson just dominated that game. And of course, Texas A&M scored with 2 seconds left in the game. But defensively, they played hard. They stopped the run. So they hit, they tackled, they put out that kind of effort. But their playmakers, it was like they were shell shocked, and they just didn't deliver. Like maybe they assumed that, oh, this is going to be a similar game as last year, and then we'll be able to pull it out. But it just didn't turn out that way.
No, and I'll say this. I've watched Clemson a good bit the last 2 weeks. I think the interesting thing for Clemson is they're so far ahead of everybody. Nick Saban, or Dabo Swinney is not Nick Saban. I don't think he can motivate in the same form or fashion. And what's going to be fascinating to watch is Clemson, when they got that big lead, they took the foot off the gas. Those players realized they weren't going to lose that game, and they almost, it seemed to dial it back almost 30 or 40% and run the rest of that game at 60%. How they stay motivated. They're motivated for this week because the last time they went to Syracuse, they lost. They're likely to get up 4 touchdowns here and call the dogs off. And if there's, I think the line is 25.5 or something, maybe give up scores late and not win that game in the same fashion that the game actually indicates. That's what happened. Texas A&M gets the backdoor cover last week because, to me, Clemson just called the dogs off. They could have put up 40 or 50 on A&M if they wanted to. They just kind of backed down because they seem to lose interest. They're just so much better than everybody else.
They sure are in that conference. It's just, I don't think it's going to improve unless Miami and Florida State get their acts together, and that doesn't look like it's coming anytime soon because they're the 2 programs that have the resources and the recruiting footprint to challenge Clemson, but they've obviously fallen way off. Florida State has gone off a landslide since Jimbo left.
I don't think Miami does. I don't know if Miami ever comes back. We keep saying that. We've been saying it since 01 or whatever. Their facilities, I don't know if you've ever been there, Mark. You drive from Coral Gables to where, whatever they're, I think Hard Rocks. I don't know what they're calling it now. Wherever that stadium is.
I think it's still Hard Rock.
Yeah, it might come up with a different name. Poor Hard Rock's losing a lot of money. Between the Dolphins and the Hurricanes right now, it's a rough time. But, I don't know. People can go into Miami and get players out unlike they were able to do in the 80s and even at the beginning of this particular century. Miami has got to be able to recruit nationally because people go into Miami right now and take guys out. You look at guys like Jerry Jeudy and some other guys around the country that are making plays. Frank Ladson, who's up at Clemson now, certainly is a guy that Miami used to get. Guys are not attracted to the U like they used to be. Big-time prospects, they go to Alabama, they go to Georgia, they go to Clemson, and they see the facilities, and then they go back to Miami, and they're not as great as they used to be. And then Miami, remember, this was an independent way back when. They could sell you on playing these massive games that they used to play. Now you're in the ACC. It doesn't get as exciting to play Pittsburgh and Boston College and whoever, Virginia. Quite like it was when they were really rolling as an independent. And then obviously when they played in the Big East, they played Virginia Tech every year. Occasionally Syracuse would pop up and be good. Maybe Pittsburgh would be okay. But they could go out and schedule these massive non-conference games like Washington or like UCLA that would open the door for them to – they don't do that quite as much. Florida was good. Miami still tries to schedule a few big games, but, man, it's different down there. Now, I don't know if they can come back like we all keep thinking they can.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking it up with Will Gunter. All new game 107.5 The Game, breaking down Alabama and South Carolina. Hopefully, the Gamecocks give us something to get interested in for at least a half or so. Will, we appreciate you stopping by. It's always a fun conversation.
Enjoy it. We're here, man. We're 2 weeks in, and you're right. It's I think we've got some good teams across the country. I'm interested to see LSU, Oklahoma, and Ohio State fight it out there to see how they fit into those top three teams. So glad to be back on.